Hello. I'd like to talk today about Venezuela. Now, Venezuela is a South American country, about 1 million square kilometers, 30 million people. And for better understanding of a South American country, we have to understand their culture, which is basically from the ex-empire, Portuguese Empire and Spanish Empire. Now, so we have two languages, which is the Portuguese and the Spanish. Now, Venezuela is a part of the Spanish speaking. Now, there are different countries. There are similarities, but of course there are differences in between the countries. Now, Venezuela is Caribbean, in the northern part of the South America, but also in the border of the Caribbean Sea. Now, that's and then on top is a resource-rich country, especially oil and gas, which sometimes might be a curse instead of a blessing. Now, we have to think in those terms, and then we have to think about the power structure of this given country. Now, if we think that inherit the Spaniard power structure, the Spanish-speaking part of the region, so we have to think about the influence of the 20% of European descendants in the Venezuela, and then we have to think about something about 70%, which is a mixture of white natives, and they call them pardos. In the United States, may call them something like, because they like to establish in the United States ethnic differentiations. So they might, they usually, even the press, sometimes they call them brown people. Now, it seems to me very derogative term, but that's what they use usually. Now, the religion is 70% Roman Catholics and about 10% Protestants and some other minorities, religions and sects. Now, it's resource rich, really resource rich. Is I think one of the largest reserve of oil. So no wonder that Venezuela had a very difficult relation with the United States. But during the last century, the ruling classes, which mainly are from the European extractions, and then of course there is a mixture. Let's call them the fifth column in a country, in a given country. That term they use it in Russia today. They talk about the fifth column. Now, to understand what the fifth column is, we have to go back to the Spanish Civil War. There were 4 convergent columns into Madrid, but they have infiltrated in Madrid many thousand people working for the for the reactionary forces. They used to call themselves nationalists. They used to think that they were representing the church and the values of the extreme right. Now, to those people living in Madrid and working for the nationalists, they were called the fifth column. So that's where the terms come from. So in this part of the world, the fifth column was mainly from the ruling classes, and mainly the ruling classes, they were most of European descent until the last 50 years that things start to change somehow. And we have to differentiate because the southern corn, Uruguay, Argentina, and Brazil are very different in the structure, in inhabitant structure from the Colombia and Venezuela. Now, what happened that Venezuela was, of course, like in the last century, suffered the direct intervention of the European, of the American corporation, especially from the oil business, with the Rockefellers and things like that, ExxonMobil and many others. Now, in the last part of in the 20th century, in the 1990s, something happened in Venezuela. Of course, nothing happened suddenly. It took many years to the workers and to this called them the people who always obeyed the orders of the upper middle classes and the powerful, which were supported always by the church and by the military. When I'm talking about the military, I'm talking about the officers' corps and the top echelons of the officers' corps. Now that's in brief the history of this continent. Now, what happened with Venezuela, with the oil? Well, in the last half part of the last century, of course, there were many the United States through their corporation, I mean the corporation through the United States government, because the corporations seems to have the power, not the government per se in the United States. It has some power, of course, but the shadow government is run by, especially in this century, by the corporations. And although 60 years ago someone said that what is good to General Motors is good to the United States. Now those things change because Detroit now is in shambles, catastrophe. Now, see what happened in Venezuela. All of a sudden, the power was taken by a colonel in those days, supported by the military and the poor people. And he started what he called Bolivarian revolutions, based on Simón Bolívar ideas about the society and what should South America be. Now, if we think with a European perspective, what he tried to do was something similar to the social democracy, which he called socialist revolution. Of course, it was not a socialist revolution because to think about socialist revolution, we have to think about a total structural change of the economic system and then of the philosophy of life, the style of living. Now, this was not done with that perspective in mind, like in Cuba, which was a socialist revolution guided by the Communist Party. Now, Chavez relied in that perspective of distribution, and of course reparation to the working people and the poorest people in his country, which of course is indeed a good thing. But he was able to do it because around the 2004 or until for several years, the price of the oil was increased exponentially. So with that windfall income, he was able to implement some sort of redistribution or subsidize, then work very much in the health systems and in the education systems. Now, to understand, or my perspective of socialism is that it's a philosophy, a social philosophy, economic system, but we need to have a base of culture. So it's not only about literacy, it's about cultural behavior. And when you have a population that was submerged and then for centuries were accustomed to obey orders, and they develop some sort of poverty culture, which is an dependence culture, which is a lack of sometimes of responsibility for their home behavior, because they were used to be guided and order. Now, what happened is that Chavez changed partially those things. He distributed, but all those things should be also with a change in behavior, in the cultural behavior, and didn't happen. When he died, he chose Maduro as his heir, and he followed the same pattern, but with the prices of oil falling dramatically, the possibilities of Venezuela to implement all those programs, social programs that were mainly of distribution, was in jeopardy. And in the other sense, Venezuela was based in, it is based in a capitalist economic systems. There are certain limits where an economic system can change in this in this mode. In the first, capitalist system is based on profit, and if the capitalist system doesn't make profit, the upper middle classes and the richest, the owners, landowners, factory owners, the industrials, financial, they work against that type of system because it's in contradiction with their interest. And the upper middle classes that always link with the richest one, they start to rebel as well. And then this 20% of the population, they see how the people that they used to order, to govern, rebels, and they don't obey any longer. And that is a big shock. Now, to disrupt the capitalist system in its structure, we only can see problems developing, and that's clear. Cannot rule a system by decrees, by laws. The system follows its logic, and it's the logic of capitalist economic laws of performance. And they won't do willingly the things that the government want them to do. Of course not, because they have to make some profit. And if you put ceilings on the prices, then you only create a black market. And then when the system start expanding the monetary, the means of payments in the last 10 years, perhaps some less, when the income of the oil was depleted, then they thought that they expanded the means of payments at an incredible rate. That only brings inflation. They have nowadays something about 700% or 800% or some more. They are in hyperinflation. Now, hyperinflation is a social economic disease, and the relation within a given society, they start to, the contradictions, they increase exponentially, and the ones who suffer are the poor part of the people, which nowadays is the majority in Venezuela, because hyperinflation only brings poverty. Hyperinflation, and we add the unemployment, then we have misery. There is an index based on those terms which called misery index. So no matter how the intentions are to bring some change, it have to be done in a different way. And then the socialist Venezuelan Socialist United Party or something, they want to impose drastic change in the middle classes, in the capitalist middle classes, and not much in the real powerful. And it doesn't work. And besides, the United States as a hegemon country with large interest in the southern part, won't allow by no means what we may call, not socialism, let's call them progressive. The governments that, or political parties and government that put the accent on the working people and the poorest segments of the population, and of course they are the majority, so they get elected. But when they get elected, these so-called progressive, they're corrupt as well. And we saw them in Argentina, in Brazil, Paraguay, Peru, all over the area. Now, there are some similarities between what Allende wanted to do in Chile, but he lost less than the so-called Bolivarian Revolution. He was toppled because he was a danger for the minority in Chile and for the United States, because he was socialist in the time of the Soviet Union, which in those days was powerful. So the region may oscillate towards something lefted. So they didn't want to have another Cuba, so they toppled Allende. And what they did with Allende, they did it with the technique of transportation, paralyzing the transportation, paralyzing the food supply, created inflation, and delegitimizing the government. And eventually they did it through the armed forces in conjunction with the civilians. All the coups, or the great majority of coups performed by the military in the last century in this region, first they have to have the blessing of the United States, which they always had. And of course they were always in conjunctions with the ruling elites, that they saw a dangerous change with those so-called progressive governments. Now, that's the way things are nowadays in Venezuela. The United States, with this president, that he says so many things in his ignorance, or perhaps he wants to, I don't think he knows exactly what he's talking about with the region, because to threat militarily a South American country, the governments, they might be the right-wing governments, but the great majority of people, they have memories, and they will reject emphatically any military action in South America. United States did it in Panama, which was an invention, or a country invented by the United States in order to get the canal. And when they went after Noriega, And then they did it also in Granada, and then but that was history in Santo Domingo, and that was in Central America. But a direct intervention of military forces in the South American continent, I can recall in the last century, the last part of the century. Now, what they might do is what they're doing is trying to provoke the civil unrest, cut the food supply, and then the government is trying to do some rationing, but Latin American way, because or South American way, because if we have to think about rationing the food supply with the book, ration book, we have to go and see what happened in Great Britain during the war. They have those things, but over there works. Now, the social democracy in Denmark, in Norway, in Swedish, Finland, it works. But there are countries homogeneous and with a very high cultural level of behavior. And try to implement a socialist distribution without a socialist production is a contradiction. And then also to have a socialist system, you have the social production, the education, the health systems, and discipline. Corruption might be under zero tolerance. How to do it in a continent that the corruption is so high, especially in the people who have the power, political power, economic power. And now the way things are. Now, from the techniques of subverting the country, which the United States has a, let's call it, rich experience, they were very successful in Ukraine. But let's think about Maidan Square. It was almost a war, civil war, with snipers shooting both sides in order to inflame the people. Now, there were hundreds of thousands of people, and it was for a long period of time. And the army, and it was paralyzed. Although things could have never happened in the United States, never. But they are successful to implementing those techniques all over the world. Now, they did it in Chile, they tried to do it in Venezuela, and the threats to military intervention, I think, is only a threat. They can do it with different means. In the last resort, they would create a civil war. They will not intervene directly. But this is not in the horizon so far. Now, the clash in this society between the middle classes and the poor ones. But also the poor are suffering, are suffering the consequences of this failed system, failed economic system, which is capitalist with interference. So my perspective, either you have a socialist production system and go all the way, or let control, sometimes of control, but not many control, because in the capitalist system the owners, which are basically the rich ones and the middle classes, and the middle classes make the whole thing works, they have to make profits. They cannot work losing money. It never works and never will work. And that's what my perspective of Venezuela. And the future or the present is bleak. On the other hand, if the reactionary forces retake control, they will not have leniency with the Chavistas, or no, they will be real, they will strike back really hard. And especially if they are supported by the United States, they will do what they please. So it all depends what the Venezuelan people do. But from my perspective, the government is in a dilemma. What to do? And that's the way things are from my perspective. I'm based mainly on open sources. I wish I had the possibility to go there and to have a first-hand look. But, well, wishful thinking. And we'll see how it turns out. The United States will not intervene military directly. No way. Even no way. And they didn't in Colombia. They had the Plan Colombia. They sent $10 billion, the largest amount of military aid after, I think, Egypt and Egypt. The Plan Colombia, which is something very interesting, because after 50 years the guerrillas warfare, they did it, so-called peace agreement, and they turn in their arms. From the Marxist perspective, because they were Marxist, and well, they tried to, what they did was a political success, because otherwise they had to surrender. Because nowadays with the technology, the guerrilla fighters are easily spotted, and that's what happened with their leaders. They were killed. There is no room for guerrilla movements in this continent. There are some guerrilla movement in Asia, but that's different situation and perspective. But in this continent failed. The Tupamaros failed. In Argentina they fell. In Chile failed. In the Sendero Luminoso failed because it's a anthropological cultural problem, perhaps a social-cultural problem. And these countries these societies are not prepared to a socialist, and they don't understand what socialist means. Most people don't understand. They have a very vague idea, but not the masses. It's hard for me to say this, but it seems to me that that's the reality, because they keep on voting to the right-wing leaders, billionaires, like in Argentina, like in Colombia, Santos. Not a billionaire, but a former United States citizen, Kowinski or something, Polish, with something Polish or German last name. It's not much. It's not relevant from my point of view, but a former banker on the Wall Street. He's leading Peru. So that's the way things are in this continent, and it's oscillating between extreme right and center right, and sometimes some progressive center left, but they're all corrupt. The progressive and the right wings, and they're all corrupt. And with corrupt societies and kleptocratic societies, we'll never get good results. And that's what I have to say for today. Thank you.